Let's go ahead and we'll go over our memory scriptures. All right, so first grade, your memory scriptures, Jeremiah 30:22.
Jeremiah 30:22. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. Jeremiah 30:22. Jeremiah
30:22. All right, awesome. Second grade, your scripture, Proverbs 18:10.
Proverbs 18:10. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are safe. Proverbs 18:10.
Awesome, awesome. Good job. All right, guys, so let's go ahead and get into our lesson. So this will be our last lesson today on Moses. So on Monday, we discussed how the Hebrews had continued their journey, their wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And during this time, we had an issue of rebellion that arose during that time. Remember, there was a man named Korah, and he felt like he could lead the people better than Moses could. So he decided to get two other men on his side, and 250 people agreed with them, and they were going to start a rebellion to overthrow Moses, and they were going to become the leaders. But of course, we know that that wouldn't work that way because God ordained Moses as the leader. So, and God showed that. Remember, God opened the ground and swallowed everything that they owned. He swallowed Dathan, Abiram, and Korah's tents, their family. Everything was destroyed because God was showing everyone in Israel that he had selected his leader, and that was Moses. And God also showed them who he chose as the high priest, because they all, one person from each tribe, brought their rod in the tabernacle. Whoever's rod blossomed, which was Aaron's, would be the high priest that God had chosen. So God had proven to them and shown them who he had selected, so no one should question the authority that God had placed over the Hebrews. So yesterday we discussed how, as they're continuing their journey throughout the wilderness, we learned that the Hebrews still didn't get the lesson on complaining, right? They still didn't trust God. They still didn't believe God, which is one of the reasons they lost the blessing, and they're still wandering in the wilderness. So whenever they ran out of water, instead of going to God and asking him to provide for them, they began to complain. They were upset. They blamed Moses. They were like, why would you bring us here? We're going to die here. And Moses was so frustrated and angry with the people, because he's like, how many times do we have to keep going through this where you complain and you complain? So Moses went, he prayed, and God told Moses, he says, bring the people before the rock, speak to the rock, Moses, and water will come out. So Moses brought all the people, but he was still a little angry. And so when he spoke to the people, he said, you rebellious people. And Moses struck the rock, not once, but twice he struck the rock, and water did come out. God did bless, the God did still perform the miracle for the people by allowing water to come out. But Moses was in disobedience, and he didn't believe in God because he didn't speak to the rock. Instead, he struck it. And his punishment for striking the rock was that he would not be able to go into the promised land. Moses would not be able to cross over into the promised land like everyone, like the other people who would be able to go into it. And so Moses was very hurt by that, but he understood and he knew the decision that God made was the right decision. Okay, so let's go ahead and pick up today, and we'll go ahead and finish. Our lesson won't be long today, so we'll go ahead and finish off the life of Moses. Okay, so as they're continuing their journey through the wilderness, like I told you guys, this whole time they would just go from different place to place. That's all they could do. When the cloud would move, they would move. So as they're going through different places, they finally reach Mount Or, which is a mountain, which is near the promised land. And there the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and said, because Aaron had disobeyed God, where Moses had struck the rock, Aaron would die here at this mount, and he would also not cross over into the promised land. So God had told Aaron to take his son Eleazar up the mountain with him, and that's where Aaron, who was the high priest, he would pass down the high priest robes to his son Eleazar. And so the high priest, you knew they were the high priest because they would wear different types of clothing. They would wear a certain type of robe. They would have an ephod and all of that. And so so God was telling Aaron that he would die, and that he needed to pass down the high priest position to his son. So everyone was sad. They made the announcement to everyone that Aaron would be going to be with the Lord. And, and so he did that. So Aaron and his son went up the mountain. Aaron took off all the robes, everything, and he placed it on his son. And only his son came back down the mountain, and Aaron died there at Mount Hor. And everyone grieved and they were hurt, because they lost Aaron. Aaron was one of their leaders as well. And so, and Aaron, unfortunately, would not be able to cross over. I mean, obviously, he wouldn't be able to cross over into the promised land. And so the people mourned for Aaron for 30 days and they continued their journey. Okay, so they continued to go and go and go.
They didn't even want Aaron.
Yeah, well, that was the people that rebelled. It wasn't everybody. So as time goes on, they've been in the wilderness. They're getting close to the end of their 40 years. Moses is now 120 years old. So he's an older man now, and he's led the people for these 40 years. He has led the people, right? He's tired, right? Very tired. During that time, while he led the people, he wrote what's called the Pentateuch, which are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Moses is the author of those 5 books. And so he wrote those books detailing everything from in the beginning in Genesis, Exodus, what happened in Exodus, where they were slaves, how he set them free, Leviticus, the laws, Deuteronomy, Numbers details some different things that happened in Numbers, but also it talks about when they didn't cross over into the promised land. That's in the book of Numbers. And Deuteronomy is Moses had given a speech to the people before we're going to talk about that in a second. He gave a speech to the people, just reminding them of the commandments of God, the laws of God, and Deuteronomy covers all of that. That's what the book of Deuteronomy is about. So 40 years Moses led the people, and now he's come to the end of his life, and now it's time for him to pass on. And now it's also time for him to select the next leader. So God had already showed Moses who he wanted to be the next leader of the people. And this leader would lead the people into the promised land because Moses could not go, right? So Moses, before he passed away, he knew that he was at the end of his life. And so he prayed one last time and asked God if God would just let him go into the promised land. He says, Lord, please, could you let me cross over? Could you let me go and see the land? I just want an opportunity to say that I've been in the land. But God told Moses, no. He told Moses no, and that's because God had already said he wasn't going into the promised land, and he's not going back on what he said. And so the Lord told Moses no. And so it hurted Moses to hear that. God told him no, but he understood. He totally understood. And yesterday I told you guys, sometimes in life we'll be told no. And especially when the no comes from the Lord, we just have to respect God's decision and trust that what God said, he has a reason why he said it. And we just have to believe in that, hold on to that, and trust it. And so Moses, it hurt, right? Because that was the whole reason he led the people out of the land of Egypt, right? Was to bring them to the promised land. And unfortunately, he would not be able to get there, but God didn't let it end there. So, Moses, he's at the end of his life. He's old now. He knows that he's about to die. So before he dies, he wants to talk to the people one more time to prepare them for what will come as they cross over into the promised land, but also to remind them of everything that God was trying to teach them. Now, remember though, it's been 40 years. So all of the children are now adults, right? So if they were 10, whenever God told them they couldn't go into the promised land, 10 plus 40, now they're 50. So the parents and the grandparents have all died off, and now the children are adults. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's been 40 years. So people grow up as time goes on. So the children are now adults now, okay? So all the parents, all the people who were told they could not go into the promised land, they've all died within this 40 years. And now the 40 years has come to an end. And so Moses wants to talk to the people one last time to remind them that you were children, but now you're adults. Now you have to make the choice whether or not you're going to go into the promised land. Don't be like your parents who refused to go, who chose to disobey God and lost the blessing. You don't want that to be that way. So Moses began to speak to the people. He reminded them of the 10 commandments that God had given them. He reminded them of all the laws that God had spoken to them. He reminded them of how to stay blessed. And he also told them how you can be cursed in Deuteronomy 28. He reminded them of all of these things that the Lord had spoken to him and them. He also reminded them that they can lose the blessing just like their parents if they choose not to follow and obey God. So he wanted to really put this in their minds and help them to remember and not make the decisions that their parents made. And so Moses spoke his farewell speech to them. This is what the book of Deuteronomy is about. That's Moses' speech. And so he spoke all of these words to him, and he told them, he says, I am 120 years old. He says, I can no longer be your leader. He says, but you all are strong. You will be courageous. He says, the Lord your God is with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. He says, listen, now that I am going, I will appoint the next leader who will lead you into the promised land. Does anyone know who he chose? Joshua. So if you remember, we talked about Joshua. Whenever they fought the Amalekites, remember Joshua was the one who led the army. Joshua was also the one when they went to see the promised land. Him and Caleb were the only two trying to convince them to cross over. And so Joshua was now, that's why they have a book of the Bible, Deuteronomy, and then it goes into Joshua. That's why. Yes. And so Joshua, he was now the name. We have a Joshua in class too. But yes, Joshua was now the appointed leader. And so everyone had knew Joshua already and they respected Joshua. So they were excited about their next journey with their new leader, which would be Joshua. And so the Lord, so Joshua is your new commander. And Moses told the people as the Lord instructed. And he told Joshua, he said, Joshua, be courageous, for the Lord your God will give you and the people living in this land, he will give the land to you. He says, Joshua, you will be the one to lead them into the promised land. And we'll talk about Joshua. We'll start Joshua next week. But Joshua will be the one to bring them to where they wanted to go this whole time, which was in the promised land. But it should be good because Joshua's leading a better group of people, right? Moses had the ones who would complain and whine and they didn't believe God. That's who Moses led. But Joshua is leading the children, right? Now they're adults, but he's leading the children and they believe more. They're not going to make the same mistakes that their parents made. They learned from the things that their parents did. They were like, we're not going to do that to God. We're not going to doubt God and then we have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. We don't want that to happen to us. That's just a waste, right? It's a waste of time. So Joshua was going to lead a better group of people. And we'll, like I said, we'll talk about that next week, talking about that. So after Moses spoke to everyone, he went and climbed Mount Nebo. That's the mount he went on. And God had called him to go on top of the mount. So when Moses had arrived on the top of this mountain, God told him to look. And when Moses looked, he was able to see all of the promised land. So he wouldn't be able to go in it, right? He couldn't cross over in it, but the Lord allowed him to see it. And so wherever this mount was, it overlooked all of the promised land. And so when Moses got to the top of the mountain, he looked and he was able to see it. And that's a blessing, right? He was able, so I told you, God still, he still gave Moses something, and that was the ability to be able to see it. And when Moses saw it, he says, Lord, this is beautiful. And he knew that the people would be so blessed once they crossed over. He wouldn't be able to go with them, but he was able to see it. And he praised God that God allowed him to see the promised land. And Moses, he knew. And so there, Mount Moses dies on this mountain. The Lord buried his body. That's what the Bible tells us. They didn't have a funeral or anything like you bury the body. But no, Moses, the Lord did it. And so, And so, yes. And so the people, they mourned for Moses because they knew that Moses didn't come back down the mountain. And they knew that this time he wasn't coming back down. Remember the last time he just was taking a long time. But this time, Moses was not coming back down the mountain. And so the people, they were hurt. They lost Moses. They were hurt by it. But yeah, but that wasn't everybody. They got rid of those people who were trying to do the rebellion. That's not the same people. And so, yep. So now the time has come. The new leader is here. The people, so this is the end of the life of Moses. And although Moses wasn't able to cross over, he had a lot of success, right? He really did. he went from somebody who, you know, he grew up in the palace. He had the lives of the Egyptians, you know, Pharaoh, the princess raised him. And, you know, unfortunately, remember, he killed the man and he had to flee to Midian. But then God came and called him out of Midian to go back to Egypt to lead the people out. And Moses went and was bold and stood before Pharaoh, telling Pharaoh to let God's people go. God performed many miracles through Moses. When it was time, Moses led the people out. Moses went to prayer for the people, went in prayer for the people every time they needed something, right? He went and prayed. God performed several miracles through Moses. And so Moses, you know, unfortunately, yes, he wasn't able to go into the promised land, but still, even in the midst of all of that, God still used Moses for many mighty miracles. And so that's the thing. Like, you know, sometimes, you know, we may want something out of life, but God will do certain things through our lives. And if that's what he wants us to do and we accomplish those things that he wants us to do, then that's enough for the Lord. You know, we have goals, but God has his plans for us. And so we have to sometimes, you know, just trust that what God is doing, that's his perfect plan. You know, we may feel like we want something different, but God knows, he knows what we need and he knows what he put us on the earth to do. And so, yes, God already knew Moses wouldn't go into the promised land. He knew that. But God still used Moses in a mighty way in several ways. He helped the people to get to where they were, right? And now when we start Joshua next week, we'll see how they're ready now. They're at the border of the promised land and they're ready now. So this is the life of Moses. This is the end of our lesson on Moses. Like I said, when we get back from break next week, we will move on to our next person, which is Joshua. We'll do Joshua for probably for a couple of weeks, and then we'll go on to something different, okay?
Moses is the longest one.
All right, so good, guys. So that's it for Bible this morning. I hope you have a good break as we break for a little while, and then I'll see you guys for Zoom, okay? Bye-bye.